And what's really interesting is if you're looking at, say, ADHD, how is dopamine created? How is it synthesized? Essentially, you need tyrosine, which comes from eating protein, and then it needs to be converted into dopamine. And the primary mineral that helps with that is iron. So if you've got glitchy genetics, you find it quite hard to make dopamine and you're relatively low in iron, guess what? That's the perfect storm for much more severe symptoms of ADHD.
Hello and welcome back to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm Dr. Emmie Brown, joined by my co-host Melissa Gentile. Today, we're joined by one of the UK's leading voices in functional medicine and pediatric nutrition, Lucinda Miller. Lucinda is the clinical lead of NatureDoc, the UK's largest functional medicine clinic, and has over 25 years of experience as a naturopath, herbalist, and nutritionist. She specializes in neurodevelopmental nutrition and functional medicine and is the best-selling author of The Good Stuff, I Can't Believe It's Baby Food, and her latest book, Brain Brilliance. In this episode, we'll explore how Lucinda and her team use advanced testing, evidence-based nutrition, and a deeply personalized approach to support children with autism, ADHD, sensory challenges, and more. Whether you're a parent, practitioner, or simply passionate about brain health, this is a conversation full of insight, hope, and practical tools. So let's dive in. Thank you so much for being here, Lucinda.
Emmie, it's great to be on the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Lucinda, we're so excited to have you on today. And I want to start out with what even inspired you to specialize in children's nutrition, particularly for neurodivergent children?
Well, I'm a mum of three and, raising kids can be complex. And we have various things along the way that we've had to kind of help or iron out or support. So our eldest, we could see was on the trajectory for getting a diagnosis of ADHD and dyspraxia. And it was something we were told, you'll have to wait 3 or 4 years and then you'll probably get the diagnosis. And we thought, what can we do now to help him? Equally, our daughter got bitten by a tick and developed Lyme disease. And so we had to do a lot for her to help support her immune system alongside the medical treatments. And then our little one had just a very severe case of cow's milk protein allergy. And we had to do a lot to support him. And what was amazing was by the time he was 3, he was able to start tolerating dairy. And now he's our greatest dairy eater. So he really enjoys it and loves it, and he tolerates it very well. So I guess we've navigated some sort of bumps along the way, and I've learned so much from them. And then that really led to, even though I was a naturopath already, it kind of focused in on me becoming much more dedicated to children's health because I felt it really wasn't being supported nearly enough.
Especially in the health space that we're in from a more integrative or, holistic or functional approach. And I can only imagine how difficult nutrition can be with young ones.
I think that a lot of people are a little bit kind of nervous about working with kids, but actually what's phenomenal is that the parents are so motivated to help their child. If your child's not sleeping, they're not speaking, mood swings are ruling your whole household, you're going to do something about that. And so actually I find that you have the most compliant clients and equally, the parents are your true teachers because they show you how it's possible. They think out of the box for you, how to get the supplements in, how to change the diet, interesting new products, interesting new ideas to put in. And actually, I've learned so much from them. So really, a lot of my knowledge comes from working with lots of wonderful families who are committed to their children's well-being.
I love this collaborative approach that you're bringing to the table already, Lucinda. And I'm sure you've learned a lot from your own personal experiences. You've already inferred, and I'd love to hear about your personal journey. I know you mentioned on a prior podcast with a different host, your personal ADHD diagnosis. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So actually, it first came from when I first got together with my husband because he had just been diagnosed. And this was a long time ago. We're looking he was probably 25 years ago. He had the diagnosis. And so it was something that I think I'd heard of, but I hadn't really thought about before. But when he started talking about it, I thought, that rings lots of bells with me too. And I think, like so many mums, when you have babies, you become incredibly depleted. Your hormones are all over the shop. And that can really magnify ADHD symptoms. So suddenly I was in a space where I think, I've always had ADHD. I now know that. But at the time, I hadn't seen it as such an issue. But when you're caring for a little one, taking responsibility, someone 24/7, not just yourself, and again, the intensity of it all, things become much more magnified and a higher need. So actually, I went for a diagnosis, which came back as positive, when my son was about a year old. And it really helped me to understand my brain. It's sort of lots of light bulb moments about just how I learned as a child, how I structured my day, how my brain kind of was wired. And it was great to know that. I didn't consider medication at the time because I wanted to have another baby. This was 23 years ago. We didn't really know whether you could take the medication and be pregnant or breastfeed. So, and also I was a naturopath at the end of the day. So I'm always curious about what Mother Nature can bring to you in terms of helping, supporting all aspects to your health, including your brain health. So that's really what I focused in on. I thought what was safe and sensible to take and to consume if I was planning to have another baby. And yes, my brain health came together so much better. And my husband and I really focused on things like blood sugar balancing, magnesium, omega-3, those sort of basics to begin with. And they really, really helped. And so we brought that sort of into the mindset for when we had the babies too. So we thought, well, if two of us have got ADHD, it's likely that at least one of them will. And in fact, 2 out of 3 have ADHD. One has dyspraxia as well. And so we did put in all those things right from the start, the protein-rich foods and the slow-release carbs and omega-3 and Epsom salt baths and all those amazing things that you can do to help support children. And it really, really helped. But we still had this, where you could see your child isn't thriving as they should. And it was really, there he was, age 5. And we felt he had regressed a bit in his development. We felt he had a tic. He was having problems with his gut. He really struggled with friendships, whereas actually as a toddler, he had been quite good with friendships. So it was almost like he wasn't as he had been. And school were muting that he might need to go to a special school. And certainly that he'd never be able to write independently. He'd always be on a laptop. And it just didn't ring true with the child that we had. He was a child that spoke early. He walked relatively early. He had all those milestones. So why was he slowing up now? So that's where actually I went to an autism conference, which was in the UK, but most of the doctors there were from the US. They were sort of the functional medicine style doctors of the time who were specializing in pediatric nutrition, autism, ADHD. And I saw these incredible stories of children's lives being transformed in terms of broadening diet, helping with sleep, helping with speech development, just helping with general overall development. And I thought, if they can do that for these kids, I can do it for my son. So that's where the functional medicine really came in. And I ran a whole host of tests from organic acid, amino acids, stool test, toxin tests. And we found some really interesting things that were going on. The most amazing thing is most of him was really healthy, and I was really thrilled, Of
course.
But there were 2 aspects that we needed to really work on. And one was he had a parasite in his gut, Deontoma fragilis, which is very, very common. We pick it up a lot. You'll see it in a lot of the stool tests through Vibrant. And what's really interesting is when we treated it, he woke up and he said, "Mummy, my brain's not playing hide and seek anymore.
Wow.
I can concentrate."
Oh my gosh.
I have chills.
Yeah.
I know. It was just that moment. And what was extraordinary was ever since then, I've always thought whenever that has come up in a stool test, I wonder if that's affecting that child's focus, concentration, organization skills, etc. And then a study came out about 2 years ago. It was in adults, not children, but it was still fascinating, talking about Diantomida fragilis. And there was another one which was about blastocystis hominis, which again often comes alongside.
And it's overlooked oftentimes, look for other causes of symptoms. Oftentimes it's kind of just written off as non-pathogenic, I find. But I don't think we should think so easily about it.
But I always have thought of it as a parasite, draining. And what's fascinating, this study was saying that it was affecting those people that had this parasite in their gut, affected their executive function. And then it drilled down to, inflaming the gut, opening up the tight junctions, affecting methylation. And I thought, what a fascinating study. You don't normally get all those angles, all the things that we see as naturopaths, functional medicine practitioners, were suddenly all there in a paper. And I thought I was right.
Thank goodness.
Even though it's a hunch, but I was right. Anyway, as I said, he thrived from there. And we also found lead. And, I know that's a very common thing to be looked at in America. It's quite routine. But in the UK, wow, we're very behind. And so therefore, we don't have lead certificates for houses when you rent or buy them. It's not routine for children to be tested. So therefore, there's a lot more lead issues going on because it's just not thought about so much. Anyway, again, I'm sure that was affecting his IQ and his ability to learn. Because again, he, as we put in the detox things, all the lovely pectin and Epsom salts and zeolite and things like that, he just blossomed, and he's a bright young man now. He's just turning 24. He's got a great university degree. He's got the career of his dreams, lots of lovely friends. So he's really happy. He's still got ADHD. We've all still got ADHD. So that will always be with us, but actually it's now in its much purer form. So he's much more adaptable and he's able to really thrive with it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's such a wonderful way to start off and hopeful way to start off this conversation. And you touched on these already a little bit, but I want to know more specifically, Lucinda. You mentioned on your site that you often uncover obvious details in the health history for your patients that other practitioners just didn't take the time to discuss. Can you give us a couple examples of what essential history pieces or signs that might be overlooked for other practitioners?
Well, I think it's quite typical, really, of the typical child will come in to see us having seen medical doctors for neurodevelopmental issues. They'll have had a diagnosis, but as we all know, most of the time you get, well, there's nothing we can do. We can give them a good educational journey or the right educational journey, maybe some speech and language, input, but really very little more. Okay. And if you're incredibly lucky, blood work will have been done as well. So they often look just to see if there's anything more significant going on. Mainly they're looking for, signs of potential things like cancer or serious illness. Especially if a child has regressed, they're looking for inflammation and things like that. But oftentimes that does not come up at all. But I would say the big thing that often comes up is relatively low iron. So it may not be full anemia, but it may be relatively low ferritin levels. So for a child and even an adult, to have the right energy levels, to help with the immune system, nice thick hair, generally good mood, etc., you need that ferritin level to be around 70 to 100. That's what we like with functional medicine. But so often it's 15, 20, 21, something like that. And it's just not enough for that child. It may not be anemia, but it's still iron deficiency. And what's really interesting is if you're looking at, say, ADHD, how is dopamine created? How is it synthesized? Essentially, you need tyrosine, which comes from eating protein, and then it needs to be converted into dopamine. And the primary mineral that helps with that is iron. So if you've got glitchy genetics, you find it quite hard to make dopamine and you're relatively low in iron, guess what? That's the perfect storm for much more severe symptoms of ADHD. Now, there are lots of reasons why iron might be low. Again, it's just usually the typical approach is let's pile in some, an iron prescription and see what happens. And that's only if the iron's that low anyway. Usually you're sent off to buy it from the chemist or from a health food shop. And that can shift the dial sometimes. In most cases, you can go up quite quickly with that. But so often, actually, why are they low in iron? Maybe they're a fussy eater. Of course, lots of kids live off beige, crunchy food without very much iron in them. Of course, that is a big factor. But then actually there can be kids who eat with gusto and love their food and eat really, really well. And they've got that mama who's doing lots of cooking from scratch, etc. But they're still got really low iron. And it turns out they've got malabsorption, they've got gut inflammation, they've got celiac disease, they've got H. pylori. And this is where these vital tests can uncover why they're not absorbing. It could be the parasites, and, those blastocystises and defragilises and even that little threadworm, the pinworm that tends to be in so many kids, that can really deplete a kid of zinc and iron, which are so important. I mean, iron is the most abundant mineral in your central nervous system and zinc's the second most. So if you don't have those two in abundance, then, the wheels can fall off very easily.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. I've also heard I wanted to bring this up, the connection between having parasites and being deficient in iron. I don't know what the link is there. Is that something that you're seeing kind of hand in hand?
I see it quite a lot, yes. So especially threadworm, a lot of kids have chronic threadworm. It's very difficult to get on top of. There's some really gross facts, like one female threadworm lays 11,000 eggs.
Oh, that's wild.
It's
and are
wild.
you waiting to have a parasite come back on a test, or are you doing more routine parasite protocols on children, or do you only kind of take them through that if you see it come back on like a microbiome test?
So first of all, I think you very rarely get a positive threadworm infection on a stool test. You usually get more of the amoebic parasites come up, a giardia, blastocystis, some cryptosporidium, that sort of thing will come up. But actually the threadworms don't usually show up in the stool test so easily. Usually there's a history. There's usually, we can't get rid of the blighters, or the brother always has it, or, the best friend from school always has it, or, something like that. They're grinding their teeth. They're waking up at 11 p.m. just, either talking in their sleep, screaming in their sleep. Little girls that they can go to the front bottom as well as the back bottom. So, they can really, really be irritated by them. But what's really fascinating is I've had kids where they've been described as that child you would never invite to tea because they are so mean and tricky and all over the shop.
Like irritable.
And they do a parasite cleanse and suddenly they're the nicest, calmest, sweetest boy, and you
so
just think.
You're seeing personality changes. Wow.
Yeah,
so
massive personality.
Yeah, a lot that can go into this, from parasites to gut inflammation and nutrition. I mean, there's a lot of factors and avenues to kind of look down. When you are working with children within your Nature Doc clinic, what does that initial consult look like? Like what's the full intake process? What other areas are you looking at?
Yeah, really good question. So, so they will complete a health history form online before they come along. They will also send in any blood work or previous tests that they've done, because we tend to look after quite a lot of what's described as the crunchy mamas, the ones that have actually done a lot of research and seen a lot of people already, maybe. So there's often quite a big history to kind of analyze and take on board. But that primary hour and a half is really there to meet the child, get an understanding of where they're at, because sometimes a parent's perspective on a child can be, because they're in it 24/7, can see a slightly different perspective. So sometimes we miss things. We don't see the mood swings because the child's been perfectly polite and well behaved at that moment. But equally, sometimes, you can see a bit more going on that the parents can't see. So you know what I mean? So it's really important to meet them. And if they're in the clinic, we'll do an exam. It's very simple. Look at their eyes, their skin, their teeth. Look to see if they're hypermobile, that kind of thing. If they have tummy issues, we'll check their gut. We'll just see whether it's painful or not. But it's quite light and simple. And then probably at that point, dad or another carer or whoever will take the child out, because that's where mum or dad, depending on who brings them in, will want to really get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And sometimes they don't, sometimes they're so stressed that they actually don't want to have that conversation in front of their child. And that's where we will then get into understanding pregnancy, even preconception sometimes. Preconception, pregnancy, the birth, the postnatal period. Will there be, was there a time where there were lots of antibiotics at play or a very nasty virus? We're always asking, when did things change? Mm-hmm. Because I think those are the kids I'm most drawn to and fascinated to, are the children, I think, because of my son, who probably regress in their skills for whatever reason. We see a lot of kids with pandas. So that can be where strep can suddenly change, a perfectly healthy and happy 9-year-old to suddenly a child with psychosis and OCD and anxiety. So we're looking for what changed, what was going on. Is this looking like a depletion sign? Is this looking like their nutrients are low? Maybe they've had a very narrow diet, highly fussy eater, lots of gastric issues, or are we looking at more of a toxin picture, or are we looking more at an infection picture? So we're trying to kind of work out where we're going to go with the tests. We're very big on our tests. I would say probably lighter than the America, but we're still, for the UK, we like to have our evidence, especially working with children. I just find that the kids often look really healthy on the outside, but you just can't tell what's going on the inside. So it's good not to guess and to use the tests. So we'll probably discuss that with the parents. We'll work out what first few steps they can take. If it's dietary, how can we supercharge what the child is eating? Can we give them black bean brownies or whatever it might be that has lots of iron and protein in there, but they still love and are sweet? Can we supercharge with a smoothie? Can we just, make their pizza a bit healthier? Where do we go? Okay. And then again, equally with the supplements, you then use your clinical experience to maybe get them in the space where you think will help them before you get those test results back. So if they're not sleeping, you might do Epsom salt bars, you might do some extra magnesium, you may do theanine or lemon balm, passion flower, something like that to help them sleep, because we all know any child that has a bad night's sleep is going to be happier, more balanced, more productive the next day. We'd be looking at, if they've got an incredibly narrow diet, and there are lots of signs of zinc deficiency, we would probably start with that. Equally, if their blood work was showing lowish iron, we would again start with that. So we'd go in quite simple with that first consult. And then really that second consult's the fascinating one. It's where we've got all the test results back and you suddenly got this roadmap of where to take the child. And I always say that we are signposters. I say, look, okay, we've got gut dysbiosis here. We've got a parasite. We've got some deficiencies. And you say, look, we can't deal with all of this at once. So we're going to start with the gut, because then once the gut's right, then they're going to be absorbing better. going to check in 6 weeks, see how they're getting on, and then maybe add a bit more in, or maybe, and just, if we're heading in the right direction, we'll carry on in that direction, but we may need to do more at that point. So then we just guide them, until the child is right.
Lucinda, you mentioned preconception care, and I'd love to pull on that thread a little bit because we don't talk about it enough. So what are you asking mom if you're really looking at not just the child, again, you're looking at what could be going on with mom prior to conception. So what kinds of questions are you asking her?
I think the big ones are, were there any problems with fertility? Because sometimes babies take years to come along. And, was there any interventions like IVF, which would have involved medications? Were they super stressed prior to conception? Were they smoking and drinking, and partying? So babies come along when they feel like they come along. And sometimes, they're not planned. So there's sort of just get an understanding of where are we coming from. Are we looking at, more that sort of high cortisol state? Are we looking at more of the toxin state? Are we more looking at, infections? And just get an understanding of how mum was during pregnancy as well in terms of their nutrition. Because if they've got hyperemesis and they've been sick the whole way through for 9 months, their nutrition, you're going to think about depletions, aren't you, right from the beginning? Right. And equally, if there were lots of infections, the COVID babies, for instance, a lot of mums had COVID, and you have to think about that in terms of cytokine storm and oxidative stress and things like that. So you've always got to think about what was happening at the time. Was it a twin pregnancy and only one baby came in the end? Is all those things you've got to think about. There could be some trauma. Parent might have died when you were pregnant. There are all these aspects. You've got to look at all the angles and help to support them from, sometimes it's not just you. We specialize in the nutrition and the functional medicine, but we do have a wonderful little black book of incredible people that, may be able to help more with that nervous system or more with trauma or whatever it might be. But it's important to work through a lot of these things.
Right. And I imagine the birth story for the child, C-section versus vaginal, having a pet at home, being breastfed or bottle fed. All these factors should be at least explored and touched on to see if we're, having more risk in one area than another. So I think that's so important. Thank you for that. I'd love to talk a little bit more about lab testing, Lucinda. So you mentioned nutrient deficiencies. That's a huge one in the work you do. Of course, stool testing. What else do you order? You also mentioned organic acids. What do you find is the most valuable? Maybe when you're just starting to work with a child who maybe has already been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, or maybe who you suspect to be on the autism spectrum. What labs are you looking at first?
I'd say my favorite would be organic acid and amino acid, purely because you get a really good overview of your roadmap, in terms of, are you looking at more gastric issues? Are you looking at more kind of mitochondrial issues? Are you looking at inflammatory pathways, amino acid deficiencies, oxidative stress? So I love that whole aspect because it's urine as well. So even if they're still in nappies, you can or diapers, as you call them, you can, there's U bags, there are clever ways to get the urine. So I love that test very, very much. I think if it's more from, a microbiome perspective, there's been a lot of antibiotics or reflux medications, etc., then we would definitely go down that gut Zuma route. I think it's the most fabulous test. If it's more toxins, I love the total tox burden. Again, phenomenal test. And I guess in the UK, we're finding most of the time it's mycotoxins that are disrupting. And another test I really love from you guys is the NeuroZuma, which we're finding really helpful for the PANS-PANDAS kids and those with seizure activity or significant developmental delay or kind of very big neurological aspects. It's been really helpful at understanding what might be going on. But we've done it for a few mums as well, and it's remarkable what's coming up. You've got the panda's child, and actually mum's got very similar problems with their blood-brain barrier and, infections and so forth. But it's a really great test too.
I imagine sometimes you have the child coming in primarily, and then you maybe gain a client with the parent and they realize it's a family affair at that point, I imagine.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating, when you do I love working with the full family, because then you really get the dynamics and you can really get that healing together. It really makes a huge difference.
And how do you start to integrate some of these test results into your protocols? Like, how are you building out effective interventions?
I would say that is probably the most complicated part of the job. And I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, and I've been using functional tests for 25 of those. So I only came across Vibrant, as I said, maybe 18 months ago. So this is all, your tests are relatively new, but the principles, what I love about your tests is they're quick turnaround. They're much, much bigger, deep dive into various aspects, and things like not having to come off gluten to do the wheat zoomer is just phenomenal. That's just great. So there's some really great bits of your test that I love. So how do we build a really good health plan and that sort of roadmap going forward? Well, I think what I say to my practitioners, so we're a big team. We're a big team of 22 practitioners in the UK, one in Australia, one in Ireland. So we've gone a little bit global, but we are not over the pond yet in America yet. But essentially, what we do is, my first thing is to say, read the room. As in, what can this family take on board at this moment? They've done the tests. We've got about 10 different pathways to support. Where do you go? And so therefore we think, are they able to change the diet, or are they able to build in supplements? How many supplements do you think they'll be able to weave in? How sensitive is this child? Do we need to do other things first, like stabilize the nervous system before we go with those supplements? Where are they at? Some come out in with plastic bags full of supplements and they're on tons already, and others have never thought about a supplement before, so it's very new. So I think the most important thing is that, as I said, I use these words a lot: read the room, see what's going on, meet them where they're at, and start. Hopefully you've started already a little bit, as I said, between that first consult and the second consult anyway, and you'll get an understanding of what they've been able to achieve. So if you've asked them to do 5 things and they've only done 2, then you'll get an idea that they're going to be slightly more slow burn. And if you've asked them to do 5 things and they've actually done 5 plus 3 extra things you haven't even asked them to do, then they're much more fast track. So that's really important to think of that. And then if we have really complex results, which we often do, because the kids we see are very complex, is we'll probably start with the gut. We'll work with the gut health first and try and work on that sort of low-hanging fruit, whether it's the parasites, try and clear up the yeast, maybe rebalance that dysbiosis. And once you've got that right, then so often the kids are sleeping better, they're more focused, they're more regulated, and then you can start on the other aspects as well. So really, I'd say that. However, mycotoxins do trump everything. So if there are mycotoxins in the way, we do start with that. And that's usually the frustrating situation of having to remediate the house, and that can take time. So in the meantime, you want to get in the flavonoids and, really support those detox pathways and, get air filters in and, all of that kind of thing as well. But essentially, it's usually gut unless you've got mycotoxins as well.
How are you approaching detoxification of mycotoxins in children? Because some of the things that I think about is like sweating in sauna. I don't think that's safe for children. So what are some of the other ways that you're supporting that? And even dosing on supplements. Yeah, I'm sure it's much different.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I would say that majority of kids with mycotoxins sweat a lot at night anyway, naturally. They tend to be quite histamine-y, mast-cell-y, and they tend to be quite hot at night. So actually, they're almost like in their own little natural sauna in their bed. So that's something I feel that happens naturally. And yes, you can open up pathways with Epsom salt baths. There are, you can get a little bit of nettle or dandelion in teas or tinctures in to just help to open those pathways as well. The bioflavonoids, it can just be as simple as getting smoothies in, lots of lovely blueberries and things like that. We often get in some quercetin because it doesn't taste too strong and it's usually quite easy to get in, and that's really stabilizing and good. And then once we know the child's in a good space, then we will start with binders. They tend to be very gentle. It depends on which mycotoxins they are, obviously, because you have to be quite specific sometimes, but often parents are quite nervous at this point, because they're feeling pretty rubbish too, because they've been exposed to these two. So everyone's feeling a bit kind of out of sort. So we're often putting in things like fulvic acid, humic acid, zeolite. Those sorts of things can be really, really helpful and quite gentle, and you can build up quite slowly. In the UK, we don't have access to some of the medications that I know that you do have in America. So we have to use very gentle stuff. And also with children, I just feel like that's appropriate as well.
And earlier you mentioned dietary recommendations. What do you think are some of the most impactful dietary changes that you recommend?
So first of all, keeping it really simple, cooking from scratch where possible. And that's even if your child is hooked on chicken nuggets or pizza, they might not change straight away, but to slowly create that on your own at home. So try and mimic the recipe they have, whatever their favorite brand is, look at those ingredients and see, could I make them at home? And then you slowly, level that up. So maybe you choose organic chicken, different things in the breadcrumbs. You could get some ground almonds in there, some chickpea flour. A lot of kids love sweet. So as I said, smoothies can be really helpful, or even just sips of juice. It doesn't need to be a green juice. It could be orange and mango with some baobab in it or something like that. There's a whole load of different things that you can put in. They love dragon fruit because it's pink. They love Hascat berries because they're purple. So all of these things can be really, really helpful. I think they love ice lollies as well. So ice pops are great for kids. And I've got lots of recipes from all sorts, from nettle to, all types for different aspects of kids' health, because they often like ice lollies when they're sick as well. If they've got a fever, it's very good at cooling them down. A lot of kids love the idea of watermelon. Again, very cooling and calming and great. And then, as I said, it's those waffles. Get a waffle machine. Have fun with waffles. I'm known as the Waffle Meister. And yeah, I've got lots of waffle recipes in Brain Brilliance and in my other books as well, because I find that is one of the inroads to a really fussy eater, because it's crunchy and it gives that same lovely texture and mouthfeel to all those ultra processed foods, but with lots of nutrition. And you can get carrot and courgette and beetroot and quinoa and nuts and all sorts of things in a waffle. It's amazing what you can do with a waffle.
I love waffles myself, Lucinda. I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm sure there's so much flexibility with making them fun, as you just said. And it begs the question, and I had a little glitch there. I apologize. I'm not sure if we touched on this. I don't think we did. But what is your stance on gluten and dairy? You mentioned dairy and your son having an issue initially, but now he can tolerate it just fine. And so this lifelong kind of approach or avoidance of gluten, I think, is a very popular concept in functional medicine. What's your stance on, let's just go with gluten first, and then, if you want to speak on dairy a little bit, how do you build oral tolerance? And it sounds like you absolutely believe that it's possible. So how do we do that?
Yeah, great question. So, of course, there are people with celiac disease. And at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there's no direct solution for that. And so that is a lifelong, avoidance of gluten entirely,
Sure.
100%. And obviously there are some people who are actually allergic to wheat, for instance, or other grains, gluten grains. And again, that's something they can't have. But a lot of the time it's some sort of intolerance. Now, when you're thinking about neurodivergence, often the first thing people read about is the gluten-free, casein-free diet, which can be remarkable. So there's a little boy that actually came to our clinic in January, who's 3.5, non-speaking, and was eating 5 or 6 foods. And actually, it was one of my team who saw him. But this is all on my Instagram, so people can see it. It's an open story as such. And anyway, he was so particular with what he would eat. And my practitioner identified that everything he was eating was gluten or dairy, casein. And they said, I know this is going to be really hard, but I want you to try and remove that. So they had to actually swap them out to other types of ingredients. And I kid you not, within a week, he was curious about what his mum was eating. And within a month, he was eating literally everything from pomegranates to quinoa to everything. So, and it's slow. He's severely autistic, but he has made really good gains in terms cognitively as well. So it can work, but I would say that you would know within 2 to 4 weeks if it's helping or not. And if it's not, do not bust a gut to keep on sticking through. I mean, sometimes it can take longer, but most of the time you're going to see some uptick. Often it's better eye contact, maybe less needing to stim as much, maybe better sleep, maybe just less gastric issues. So oftentimes you will see a child finds it easier, but it's not always gluten and it's not always dairy. And I think sometimes it's not both, sometimes it's individual. So wheat in itself is, especially modern wheat, so this Canadian strain that most wheat is these days, is incredibly difficult. The proteins are very, very difficult to digest. And it's why so many people get bloated from eating wheat, etc. Equally, genetically, there are these HLA-DQ genes that a lot of people inherit, especially if you are originally from, say, the Northern Hemisphere, especially sort of Scandinavia. So that my grandmother was Danish and, so we have the HLA. So we have lots of celiac disease, lots of autoimmunity in our family. So there are times where, gluten isn't right. But actually, very often, if you go to the lovely ancient grains, einkorn, spelt, kamut, whatever it might be, then it is better tolerated. So, or if you have sourdough, that can be better. Again, if you go organic, then you're not going to have the glyphosate sprayed on it. So, in fact, sometimes it's not actually the wheat's fault. It's another aspect. It's the preservatives. It's in the bread, or it's, as I said, the glyphosate. It's not necessarily the gluten. So sometimes you do need to sort of have a really think around it. And that's where we can do those tests and find out, if there is significant glyphosate or significant propionic acid in the body, then you're thinking that could well be glyphosate, Then the dairy, right? So the big problem with mainly autism, but not always. We see this in kids who don't even have any specific diagnosis and don't meet the criteria, but still are really disrupted. So it's the casein. The casein is one of the proteins. So the gluten's the protein in the wheat and the casein's the protein in the dairy. And the theory is that these only get partially digested in the gut. And so you've got these mini proteins that known as peptides, which don't get properly digested. And if you've got leaky gut, they go into the bloodstream and up to the brain and cause an opioid effect, which is highly addictive and can make the child zone out, can disrupt their sleep, can lead to excess stimming, low eye contact, etc., etc. And just occasionally, if your child does have this, and we can test for it, then guess what happens? You take the gluten out or the dairy or whatever you need to do. It's sometimes both, sometimes just one. Suddenly, it's almost like a light bulb is switched on again. and they're brighter, they sleep better, they're more focused. And it can be brilliant, but it's not always. And I think my messaging is that it's something to think about, but not to. I've seen people who said, did it make any difference? No, but I've heard it's good for autism, so I've stuck with it for the last 12 years. And actually we introduce it and there's no apparent change in the child. And actually it's made it much easier for them to be fed, and they can go out to a meal and they don't have to think about it 24/7. So just occasionally, and enzymes can be really helpful too. There are specific enzymes you can take that help to break down the gluten and the casein. So actually in emergencies, or if you're eating out or you're going to grandparents' house or whatever, or school or nursery aren't so on it, you can sort of navigate that too. So it's not a forever thing always.
Well said. I love the troubleshooting tips.
And Lucinda, I know we're coming up on the hour here, but I did want to touch on your book, Brain Brilliance. So you mentioned it briefly earlier. You said that there's some recipes in here, but tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write it, and how does this book serve both practitioners and parents navigating neurodiversity?
Oh, lovely Brain Brilliance. I think Brain Brilliance has been my heart for a very long time. So I wrote The Good Stuff 7 years ago, which was, I realized, first book, you've got to reach as many people and parents as possible. So I wrote it for everybody. However, if you read through it, there's an awful lot about feeding the brain, because it's something I'm so passionate about. Yes, there was stuff about immunity and gut health as well, but it was mainly about the brain and behavior and the links with nutrition. And then I wrote a little one for babies called I Can't Believe It's Baby Food. And again, very much focused in on the developing brain, because we could see so many kids where if you could navigate that food journey earlier on, I wonder what we could do to prevent some of the road bumps along the way. But Brain Brilliance has always been in my heart and my soul to write, purely because of our neurodivergent brains, my kids' neurodivergent brains. The kids I've worked with, the parents I've worked with are just phenomenal. As I said, they really have been my teachers, and I just wanted to share this information. But I think so often these books I find absolutely fascinating, and I think I've read pretty much everybody's book on autism, ADHD, nutrition. There are some absolute legends out there who I just think incredible, the real trailblazers, the Richard Frys and the James Greenblatts and people like that are Dan Rossignol, Martha Herbert. They've been all phenomenal. However, what I found was there was a lot of theory, and you come out of the book the other end going, where the heck do I start? And because I guess being a mama and understanding how parents really need that roadmap and those recipes, they need to know where to start, that I wanted to combine the two, and I wanted to make it easy to read, and I wanted to be little sections where people could dip in and out. So each chapter is not really a chapter, it's more of a section. We'll focus in, there's one on focus and procrastination, there's one on the sleep thief, there's one on, won't eat, so like, kids with really fussy eaters, emotional dysregulation. So so everyone can dip in and either read the whole thing, which doesn't take very long, 3 or 4 hours, or they can go back to certain sections depending on what their child's doing at that time. And then in the back, lots of lovely recipes to bring it alive, make it doable and achievable.
I love that. We'll be sure to link these down in the show notes for you guys. So if you want to check out Lucinda's books, you'll be able to locate them. And Lucinda, where else can we find you online?
So thank you. So our clinical website is naturedoc.com. And then my Instagram feed is naturedoc.kids. I am on all the other social medias as well, but probably Instagram is where it's really happening. So that's where I'd find me. And we'd just be great to connect with as many people globally who are in the Vibrant family, whether you're practitioners or parents or just, people who are interested. We'd be delighted to connect with you.
Well, thank you so much, Lucinda. It's been great having you on the show today. I still have so many more questions. I really want to dig into that parasite study that you mentioned earlier. If we can get that or dig that up, we'll link it down below for you guys also, along with her Instagram handle and her website, so you guys can connect with Lucinda. Thank you again for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. And until next week, wishing us all vibrant health and wellness. Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. And just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guests and hosts are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.